Good afternoon, everyone. I have absolutely no problem if you refer to me as Mutt from here on out for this talk. I'm Jeff Mann. I've been in the cybersecurity business for over 40 years. I've been doing PCI for 20 years since the very beginning. But I cut my teeth back in the mid-80s to the mid-90s at the National Security Agency, thus the uniform here. A little awkward that I walked in 2 sessions ago and they were talking about cryptography, and there I am in the crowd. Jeff, why don't you introduce yourself real quickly?
Sure. Jeff Zitomer, I lead product management at Human Security for client-side defense and the PCI DSS requirements that relate to client-side 643 and 1161. My main focus is making it as easy as possible for entities to protect their payment pages in compliance with these new requirements and really simplify as much as possible, remove as much of the pain as possible from becoming and remaining compliant with these new requirements that frankly are very new to everybody. And that's why the focus of this talk isn't actually going to be a sales pitch of the product, but trying as much as we can to help inform people to understand this new space. How does the browser impact things? How does your web application impact the scoping, security, and then finally compliance with these requirements?
Great, thanks, Jeff. When I was at NSA, I was there at a unique time in history where the digital age and the internet age was really starting. I started out as a cryptographer. I was actually designing systems, crypto systems that were being used by the DoD and military. A little bit later on, when the internet became a thing, a couple guys and I, we started thinking, oh, we should figure out how to break into systems and networks and computers. They mentioned the movie Sneakers 2 sessions ago. That was sort of the inspiration. It came out in 1992. So a bunch of us learned how to break into computers and networks. We were doing hacking, and I identify as a hacker these days, but I ended up becoming the architect of the first NSA Red Team. Came out into the private sector almost 30 years ago, and wanted to try to help companies as they were trying to plug into the internet and figure out how to do commerce on the internet, break into their systems and tell them how to fix things. Got really frustrated that nobody was listening, and then around 2004, PCI came along, and my clients, even though they didn't care anymore, they knew they had to do security if they wanted to be PCI compliant. Very briefly, in the time we have here, everybody's been talking about these 2 requirements, 643 and 1161. We're going to try to do a little bit of a different spin on it for this session, try to get into a little bit more of the mechanics of understanding what it is that we're talking about. So the merchants, the providers, and the assessors are better equipped to go out and have these conversations because we're only 6 months away. By now, most of you have read it, most of you have embraced at least some rudimentary understanding of what these requirements are. I want to focus for a few moments on the why. Now, I've been around from PCI from the very beginning, and back in the early 2000s when PCI came out, the bad guys were stealing data because they would break into networks and find the database, the mother lode, where the tens of millions and hundreds of millions of cards and data was stored. And they'd get in, steal it, and get out. And that's kind of the beginnings of what PCI, the data security standard, was built on trying to protect. I actually had a client back in those days, in the late 2000s. There was this hacker ring and some very famous data breaches. One company just down the road, 20, 30 miles west of here, was a client of mine. And I spent a lot of time with them trying to help them figure out and understand PCI compliance. I call it PCI security because at the end of the day, it's information security. I spent too long one afternoon trying to explain cryptography and encryption to this one gentleman. And at the end of my discussion, he said, yeah, Jeff, but we really don't need DoD level security. Fast forward a few years, the bad guys figured out, hey, we don't have to steal the data off the database. We can start picking out transactionally, one at a time. And so in the early 2000s, think Home Depot and Target, even more credit cards were stolen because the bad guys were patient enough to steal them one card at a time. Fast forward a few more years, and we've got this thing called mage card attacks, where the bad guys figured out how to do that harvesting and skimming not from the retail locations, the brick and mortar, but off the websites. So that's kind of why 643 has evolved as being part of the PCI standard. It's because the bad guys are evolving their methods. I think about that guy that I talked to so many years ago, and the response I want to give to him these days is, yeah, you really do need DoD level security. So think about it. We all have to go through that security awareness training every year. In the last couple years, it's all about stop the fish, stop the fish. In the early days, it was don't click on the attachment. So it's embedded into our psyche, hopefully. Don't click on the link, don't open the attachment, don't follow this link, don't do this, don't do that. But effectively these days with web applications, e-commerce applications, every time we load one of those things, we're taking unknown number of scripts and kind of trusting them as they load onto our client-side browser, our experience. And while the council's put out the standard and add this requirement, and they've added some clarification to try to help us understand the scope, the where, and the when, and the which ones, as an assessor, I'm approaching my clients with, this needs to be done. We need to figure out who owns what and who needs to do it. But at the end of the day, if you're my client and you're a merchant, you're the one that has to say, yeah, this is being done, whether it's being done by you or whether it's being done by one of your third-party service providers. I'm a dinosaur. I understand client-server and three-tier architecture. Jeff is going to talk to us a little bit about modern website architectures and get into a little bit of the mechanics of what this is all about. Take it away, Jeff.
Awesome. Thank you, Jeff.
Mutt, that is.
That's right. So yeah, to better understand the requirements themselves, why they're needed, how it affects security, compliance, and scoping, we first need to understand a little bit about how a browser works and how a web application works. So I'll just start at a very high level. When a user visits a website, they get a whole bunch of the browser gets a whole bunch of resources. It organizes them in the DOM tree, it runs whichever JavaScript, and then it renders the page. Now that code that gets fetched and all those entities that get fetched are fetched into a sandbox. Sandboxes are great because they mean that any code can operate freely within the sandbox, which is a restricted environment. Outside of the sandbox, they can't do very much. The other part about the sandbox is that understanding how it maps to the browser itself. You naturally get from the browser, or you can naturally get from the browser, a sandbox that roughly maps to host domains, tabs within your browser, iframes, and in some cases, web pages. But let's dwell for a little bit on what it means to execute freely. So it's very important to understand, any code that is loaded into that one sandbox, it can do all of these bad things and more. The main issue here is the browser doesn't have any kind of access control or any kind of segmentation within a sandbox. So all this third and fourth party, fifth party scripts, all these scripts that are running on your site can effectively do all those bad things from before. The browser doesn't natively give you a way to control for that. And so armed with that knowledge, how do we go ahead and figure out then what are the boundaries of this sandbox? How do we form them? How do we treat the different parts and create that segmentation and isolation? Well, we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We already know as PCI professionals, as security professionals, about segmenting networks and the idea of you have your CDE, you have your connected to system, and then you have everything that's out of the scope. How do we now take that and apply that to web applications? So if we look at the typical e-commerce site, and sticking to one of the most common examples, but obviously there are permutations on this, the CDE or the payment page or form is what typically comes from a payment service provider. Then there is the embedding page, as the standard calls it, that embeds that payment page or form. We're going to call it checkout page now just for simplicity. That sort of relates to what a connected system is to a CDE. And then the last thing for us to understand is where's the boundary between that checkout page and the rest of the web app? Is it just what the user sees when they see the /checkout in the URL, or is it in fact more than that?
It's ironic, Jeff, that what you're suggesting here, what I'm hearing is getting back to that old 3-tier architecture. Only in those days it was 3 separate servers with network connection, separation, and isolation. You're just suggesting do it all now within that sandbox, within that environment.
That's right, and find how that sandbox can work for you and how you fit it into what the browser natively gives you once you're on the client side. And so with those 2 different boundaries that we need to understand. So first off, right, I use an iframe, doesn't, as I think everybody in this room knows, but often we hear it, doesn't descope you from PCI or anything like that. But the requirement does say that, paraphrasing, the payment service provider owns what's inside the iframe, the merchant owns what's outside of the iframe. It doesn't say that in those precise words. But it's very important that the iframe be properly implemented, because an iframe that is not properly implemented effectively gives no boundary at all, and it's kind of all flat and all the same. And so we're not going to talk through all of these, but there is definitely a good iframe versus a bad iframe, and part of your responsibility, even as a merchant, as a QSA, is to make sure that that iframe is actually properly implemented, not just, OK, we have an iframe, so we're good. Moving on to the second boundary, which is, I think, a lot less understood, is between just that checkout page and the rest of your web app that you would like to descope because you don't want to manage all of the JavaScript that's everywhere else on your single-page app. And for this, we have to understand first the distinction between the traditional multi-page app and the modern single-page app that most e-commerce sites these days use. So if we look at a multi-page app here, and what used to happen, it still happens on a lot of sites, is as the user journeys through the website and clicks, each time on a click that takes them to a new page, it is actually a new page. So the browser will effectively wipe clean everything that's in that sandbox that we talked about. We'll load a fresh HTML and all the fresh resources, run those new JavaScripts, and everything that was there before is gone. So by the time the user has reached that checkout page, all that you're seeing there in your script inventory that 643 asks you to manage and 1161 asks you to monitor is just the JavaScript related to that one-page view of the checkout page. Also interesting regarding HTTP headers, when each page kind of loads on its own, then each page can also load its own HTTP, security impacting HTTP headers. So you can do a lot more to tailor the headers specifically to the checkout page. Now, move ahead to single-page apps, which is what, again, most e-commerce sites, customers that we see today have. And it's a very different story. When the user navigates across the website, they are not actually loading a fresh page each time. What's happening is JavaScript on the page sees that you've clicked on something. So it goes and fetches whatever is missing and just adds it incrementally to everything that was already there, and then just renders the view that the user sees. And changes the URL at the top. So you're seeing /checkout at the top. You think you're on a different page, but you're not. It's all single-page app. You're all really on the same page. And all that JavaScript is there. So one obvious implication here is if you're going to manage that JavaScript now to secure your payment page, guess what? The JavaScript of your entire app, everything your marketing team has done, all the science experiments your developers have done on wherever other pages of the app, they are actually all there present as part of the inventory and can do all the bad stuff that we talked about in the beginning.
That might possibly be why so many people are freaking out right now about this requirement.
Indeed. So yeah, so let's just summarize that really quickly, right? So first on the right-hand side, right, is my iframe properly implemented? Yes, OK, good. Payment service provider owns the inside. If I'm the merchant, I own the outside. Now on the application itself, OK, what's my script inventory as far as /checkout? Well, if /checkout is indeed a fresh page load on its own page, then yes, you only need to manage the scripts on that page. However, if you have a single-page app, then really your whole app is your sandbox, is the boundary of that connected to system. You don't have that separation between the connected to and the rest, the out of scope. So now that we dropped, I guess, that potentially surprise to some
Not that
people.
it depends, it's complicated,
Yes.
right?
Then, okay, what do you do now? So obviously, there are a lot of options, but two kind of archetypes of options are, one, you just scope the entire app, and you have to start managing the security of all of these scripts across your entire app. And you need to take into account what can you do with security impacting headers once you know that those headers are really, you load them once with the entire app, and they kind of need to carry you through all the way to the checkout page. Option two, and it's not an easy pill to swallow, is to re-architect your page so that it mirrors that network view that we looked at before. And so you're creating that intermediary page, your checkout page. Maybe your entire single-page app is still the same, but then that last click, maybe out of the cart, that takes you to the checkout page. Only over there you do a fresh, full page load that then cleans up all of the scripts out of the inventory, and you just get only the scripts that are on that page. That ideally there should be as few of them as possible. And I am saying this as a vendor who, kind of, the more scripts you have, the more scripts you need to manage, the more my product you need. All right? And so we're happy to help you, and come talk to me later. But the right thing to do, I think we all know, is like no amount of security, and the best security tool out there isn't better than just reducing, just reducing your attack surface. So that's the best option. Right? Problem is, it doesn't come without its trade-off, right? So there's a reason why we went to these single-page apps. So first off, you're going to have to tell your developers to kind of go back from that and re-architect at least that part of the application. That's not an insignificant effort. You then, right, we went to single-page apps because they provided such a great experience and such great performance. And so giving that same level of seamless experience for the user is going to be a lot harder now, transferring all the relevant context. And it's going to be very, very small if it's done right, but still potentially somewhat noticeable that last page hop or switch to the checkout page may have a few extra milliseconds on it of latency.
Back to me.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's a principle I learned 40 some odd years ago working for the government, but and InfoSec grew out of the DoD and the military and defense in that sense. And it's really, paint a smaller target is a good thing to do. And PCI has been through that over the years. At the beginning of PCI, credit card data was literally everywhere. And even though we had a requirement to encrypt it, there were no options. So merchants slowly figured out, hey, we don't even need to store this stuff in the first place. So you get rid of it, you're reducing the footprint, you're reducing the likelihood that things get stolen. We're just trying to add a little bit of more context and add a little bit more to the discussion. We're not here to say this is the way you have to do it. We're just saying it's really time to start thinking about this in more detail. If you're an assessor in the audience, your merchants, your service provider clients, they're starting to talk to you already. It's up to us as assessors to be able to give that guidance and that advice and point them in their direction. We all say it depends. It depends how much you want to invest in re-architecting. It depends how much you have control over your web application architecture. But we're the ones that are going to be asked, so we're the ones, that's why we're talking about this at this community meeting so much. If you're a merchant and you're the one that's holding that website, don't forget you're the merchant, you're the mid. It's on you ultimately, and it's not as simple as saying, well, I've outsourced all this web page to a third party. Sure, start talking to that third party and ask them if they're understanding what all the scripts are. Are they and you understanding the architecture of your web-based application? Is it a single page or is it multi-page? What would it take to re-architect it to minimize the impact by creating that sort of semi-in-the-middle protected checkout page? If you want to talk to us more, if you want to add to the discussion, you want to agree or disagree with us, you can find us and our colleagues at our booths, human or online. But if you really want to enjoy the conversation, later tonight we're hosting a networking event along with TCT, Total Compliance Tracking, because I think this is a conversation best to be had with food and libation. 7 to 9:30, it's literally across the street and to the right about 50 feet from the Boylston Street entrance. Back Bay Social is the name of the facility. Stop by either of our booths or TCT to get more details. Want to give a shout out to Eric Fisher. He was the brainchild behind a lot of this thinking that went into this presentation. And with that, we thank you.
Thank you very much.